It's Friday, and I'm back with the next in our Fanzine Friday series. Today we're taking a look at a special issue of Thunderstruck. This is issue number 4 from 1982. Please stick around. I'm AZ Mountaineer, and this is our channel, Old School Rules, where we celebrate the community of old school gamers and grognards who like classic RPGs, miniatures, magazines, and everything that goes with it. Each week on the Fanzine Friday series, I take a fanzine from my collection off the shelf. Today we're taking a look at issue number 4 of Thunderstruck, Back with a Vengeance. This is from the summer of 1982. Hope you enjoy the video. This week we continue our look at a fanzine from the United Kingdom called Thunderstruck. It's a fantastic fanzine I'm really enjoying. You'll see right here on the cover their sort of subtitle is Back with a Vengeance. This fanzine is the product of Tim Kalvis with contributions from other people, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Alan Hunter continues to have artwork in here, and as does Kevin Bulmer, and he did Kevin did the cover, so let's take a look at that. He has 4 different illustrations there, right, to sort of key off what's the important stuff that's inside this fanzine. Some fantasy adventures. There's a fantasy RPG adventure actually designed for RuneQuest, but they mention is very compatible with D&D. Articles for Traveler or sci-fi games. An interview with Gary Gygax, which is the sort of reason this particular fanzine is really well known. And then a special feature on samurai adventures. Here's our table of contents. The editorial, and he calls it Closer. And he says this is packed with a host of interesting and thought-provoking material for RPGs. You'll remember he's made a point a couple of different times about not wanting this to just be some repetitive type of fanzine that covers the same ground that others have. So he's feeling like it's getting better. It's going to 5 times as many shops for distribution. And as he says, we are really back with a vengeance. That's his theme for this. I hope you enjoy it. It's getting very close to the magazine he'd like to be producing. But he says, we're kind of fragile. We need your help. And how do we need your help? 1, give us feedback, write us letters. 2, make contributions, whether that's articles, adventures, art. He's asking for all those kind of things to be sent in. And then finally, help with the distribution of it. He says, please go to your local gaming store and ask to buy your subscription through them. That'll increase their interest in having Thunderstrucks on the shelves, if you will, there. And if you can't get any other way, then obviously you can subscribe. You can subscribe from them. Bolts from the Blue, which is their sort of here's what's happening around the hobby, and we'll talk about that. An interview with Gary Gygax, a feature on samurai, the Mystery of Howlin Island, which is the fantasy RPG. They said statted for RuneQuest, but really could be RuneQuest or D&D. Some reviews. Things Beyond, which is the recurring traveler / sci-fi RPG article. Other Ways, book reviews, and The Eternal, which is like a poem, I think is how to describe it. In terms of contributors, we've got Tim puts it together, Robert, Tim Moyes, Paul Mason, and do articles. Dave and Faye Symes here at the end, they do the book reviews, and then Alan Hunter and Kevin Bulmer are artists. And as is the case with these Thunderstruck fanzine videos I've been doing, there'll be a separate section at the end for illustrations for those of you that are interested in that. So first, bolts from the view. What is going on around the hobby, right? RuneQuest has come out with some new releases, supplements, if you will, Borderlands, Troll Pack. And Citadel has come out with some new miniatures. Yaquinto has come out with a couple of books. Traveler's come out with some new supplements. And then in terms of fanzines, he talks about a few. The Acolyte, edited by Pete Tamlin. And I have several of those. I don't think I have a complete set, but I got several of those on the shelf. Dragonlords, I think I have all but one of those. I'm looking for one last one to get. But Dragonlords is really, really good, and we'll get to that at some point. But it's a huge one. It's 20 some issues, I think. And then a couple of small ones, Lion and Lamb Chronicles and The Abyss. And I've got a few Lion and Lamb. I actually don't know how many total were produced for sure, but I might have them all. And then Abyss, which was done here in the United States. And I've got several of those. I don't know that I have a complete set of those. That one ran for 50-some issues as well. So really good stuff. For TSR, they announced there have been released new modules for Boot Hills, Top Secret, and Gamble World. And then Samurai, we've got Valley of the Mist, which is an adventure for Bushido, the Bushido game. Some new miniatures have been released, and in fact, some of those are included in the Samurai article. And then finally, he mentions a couple of products that Games Workshop has let them know are new to the shelf. Glory Hole Dwarven Mine, which was a Judges Guild release. Moonbase Clavius, which is a sci-fi release from them. And then a couple of other things as well. All right, here is the really, really cool thing, and I'll even slide over here a little bit to help you guys. I don't know if you really see the article, but I will take a minute here and really go through this. So they were at Games Day 1982, and he was able to get Gary to sit down and give him an interview, and I think some of the points in this are really, really interesting. So he sort of sets it up where they were at the event. They go over and sit down in these chairs. He puts his recorder down, right? He says, Gary was there, cigarette in one hand and playing with a coin in the other. So he was smoking through the whole interview, which is, a sign of the times, I guess. I knew Gary smoked. I guess he smoked a lot. And so he said, first thing he asked him to do is just talk a little bit about the history of D&D, how that the games he played and the books he read early on influenced what became Dungeons & Dragons later on. And then he asked him whether the game, as it has turned out, is really what he envisioned, or if he had to sort of give up some of his ideas somewhere along the way. And Gary says, no, not at all. He says, this is really the game that I wanted. He thinks AD&D is a really good rule set. Obviously, it's very thorough. As he says, it's more structured to allow for tournament play and have more structured rules for those who want it. But Dungeons & Dragons is always out there, and this is what he says, which allows anybody to put anything they want into it. So you'll see here Gary's talking about the real openness on purpose of original D&D and basic D&D, right? The Mold They Cook era, and then that soon becomes the Mincer era. But the contrast between the two systems and his idea. And here's an interesting comment. He said, AD&D is the game I enjoy playing, although not exactly. Everything isn't in the rule book, and of course I use my creativity and imagination to add to, extrapolate from, and design around in ways that have no effect on the basic rules. Okay? He says, in that respect, you can add to it, you can augment it in areas which are not keeper rules. I think he means the core or the essential rules. And so then his next comment is, I don't bother with the combat system or the magic system. And I think he means I don't tinker with or change or deviate from those parts of the rules. Rather than, the first time I read it, I thought he was saying, I don't use those rules at all. But I think, as I reread it, I think he's saying those are the rules. Like, don't mess with the combat rules. I don't mess with the magic, rules. But beyond that, I feel free to sort of play however makes the most fun. And that's what he says. The important thing is you enjoy the game you play. Then he says, interestingly, I object violently to anyone who suggests they have an addition to AD&D system, which they think is a viable part of the game and should be played. And he says, because more often than not, their ideas aren't very good. He said, and if people start using other people's rules, he thinks it would cause them to actually not enjoy playing the game, right? So one of the things you do see repeatedly over time is people saying, hey, here's this really cool rule, and it either grinds the game, like maybe the combat becomes too slow, or it's kind of Monty Hall, so the characters become way too powerful way too easily. And then, yeah, that's fun maybe for 2 sessions, but then after a couple of months, you're really bored because you've killed all the gods in the Deities and Demigods book, and you feel like there's nothing left for your characters to do, right? And I think that's a pretty fair criticism. Okay, next item on the agenda, fanzines. So he says, what do you think about those? So I'll read this to you. Well, I think fanzines are a wonderful thing in principle, and in practice in many hobby fields and interest fields, they prove to be very invaluable. That is science fiction. The fanzines gave really interested enthusiasts of the genre a forum in which to speak out, to talk about what they liked and didn't like, to exercise their writing talents and thus mature, improve, and sell stories and become actual contributing parts of the profession of science fiction. a writer or an editor, publisher, whatever. It hasn't been true, to the best of my knowledge, in fantasy adventure gaming. In that, basically, most of the fanzines have either been APAs, parentheses, which seem to me to be the last refuge of those who can be published nowhere else. And when, after all, you can write whatever you wish, and if you copy it, someone will distribute it for you, it doesn't tend towards excellence. Or they've been so desperate for material that the amateur magazines will accept anything regardless of what sort of drivel it is, how badly written or how badly thought out, and they'll publish it just to fill pages. If, and you can only blame this on the editors and publishers of these amateur magazines, if these editors and publishers would say, we want first-rate material, and make contributors give them their best effort, this would, in effect, begin to serve the hobby. It would make the publications more interesting. It would increase their circulation, would train those who were writing for them, and in the long run, give everyone more pleasure. I want to make it clear that I came up through amateur publications. So, not a huge fan of fanzines. You know, I get where he's coming from, and I think part of that is colored by his view as the person who's responsible for what D&D is, and so in some respects, a lot of what's in fanzines are perhaps he takes as being critical of the rules or what he did do or didn't do, I find that most fanzines are actually very interesting reading, maybe more so now than they would have been in 1978, but still, I enjoy them quite a bit, obviously, I do these videos. All right, why are most of the modules in D&D dungeon themed? And he says, well, if you do an outdoor adventure, the size and amount of material you need is so much more. And then that would make the product bigger and then make the product more expensive, and probably we wouldn't get very many of those sold. So next he says, couldn't you interpret this as saying basically then D&D is sort of like a board game, and that's why it's successful. And he said, you know, in the sense that it has a few rules and broad parameters, it's a game that can be played on many levels. It can be comedic, it can be an epic, and he said we wanted it to be very flexible and playable for people who wanted to put a little bit of themselves into it, and that, he says, I think is a key to the success. Next question, which is really interesting. With technological changes and advances, isn't D&D basically going to become just a computer game? He said, just like films won't ever replace books, he doesn't think that computer games will actually replace fantasy role-playing games. And we've seen through history sort of an arc, right, where I'd say a lot more money and maybe hours of play shifted towards computer games, but I think obviously we've seen a huge resurgence now in the actual sitting down at the table with other people. And so I think he was probably right about that. He talks to him about the forthcoming Dungeons and Dragons movie, and whether he feels like that's helpful. And then what's the future hold for TSR? And he says our company's diversifying, looking into fields of miniatures, war games, electronic games, computer software, books, and magazines. We're frankly shooting to become a multi-product, multi-corporate entity. The game of business is a fun business to be in. And then he asked him for sort of just a personal touch of, tell us a little bit more about who Gary Gygax is when he's not working at TSR, right? And he's talking, like fishing, horse riding, walking, shooting, reading, listening to music, but never enough time to do everything you want. And talks about how hard he's worked and how much of himself he's poured into TSR and Dungeons and Dragons in the last 5 years. He mentions here that larger companies have offered to buy TSR, so that he would have obviously made a lot of money all at once and been able to retire, but he didn't have any interest in that. I love my job. I'm doing what I like to do. And even though it's hard, to me, it's more satisfying than have a bunch of money. Which is a little sad, right, when you realize what's going to happen over the next decade. And in any event, interesting interview, very interesting interview. And anytime you can find a candid conversation like that with Gary, it's always something I think people are interested in reading or hearing about. So he came back, and then in Dragon number 63, he has this article, 2 UK fanzines are jolly good gaming journals. And so he talks about this. He mentions Dragonlords, which I mentioned a second ago, and Thunderstruck. And he says the first 2 issues were full size, and now we're down to digest size. Talks about Tim Kalvis, who did the interview, and issue 3 was going to be the smaller size. But he says this one is less chatty, less fanish, and solidly aimed at providing material to aid in running campaigns. He said this nicely complements the efforts people at Dragonlords are doing. And he thought the large format was superior to the smaller digest-sized editions, and hopes that this particular fanzine will continue to get support from subscribers, gamers, and contributors. Yeah. In spite of what he said, apparently those 2 fanzines got the Gary Gygax stamp of approval. And then he also has an article here in that Dragon magazine about his trip to Games Fair 82, which is where he met Tim and did that interview. And he talked about what he did there and how busy he was, etc. Okay, back to the fanzine. The Samurai feature is just a discussion of rule sets that are available for this. Talks about Bushido, Land of the Rising Sun, which Lee Gold, I think, was primarily responsible for developing. He talks about what a good game it is. He says it's kind of hard, sometimes when you don't know that much about Japanese culture. But he thought these rules were really well made. And then he also mentions some miniatures that have been produced by Citadel, and then others because they're reacting to the popularity of these type of games. Our adventure is called The Mystery of Howlin Island. It's an excellent. It's excellent. There's a bunch of islands. Historically, this one guy grew up and one by one took over all the islands, and then he got to the last island he was trying to take over. There was a vampire, and he and his men, most of his men were killed. Others from his kingdom came later, destroyed that vampire, and all the vampire sort of minions. Then took the people who had been the leader and the others who'd been killed by the vampire initially, and took them back to one of the islands, and they were buried. Fast forward, this island where they were buried is sort of rumored to be a place you don't want to go, and of course you're adventurers, so they give you a couple of ideas for hooks, but one way or another, you're going to end up back here at this island. And there's a little village up here, and then there's a little tower down here to the south. And so the first part of this, they only give you half the adventure, is looking where you go up to the north to the village ruins, and you find out what the mystery of the island is all about. Good stuff, really good stuff. All right, so Starship Captain, this is a review of a game, and that came out. They liked it quite a bit. They also do a review of something called the Tribes of Crane. It's a postal fantasy campaign. You get rules, and then you send in and play it over through the postal service. And they thought it was really well done. They said it's kind of expensive, but if you can afford it, we think you'll enjoy it. Then we get Things Beyond, which is their sci-fi / traveler set of articles. And they talk about something called Striker, which are essentially war games for ship battles in connection with travelers. It's meant to be connected to Traveler. You can't really use it on your own, or they don't think you can use it very well on your own. They also have I don't know if Traveler calls them character classes, but a bounty hunter, something you could choose to play, and they give you all the stats and things like that to play that in your home campaign. Okay, Other Ways by Paul Mason. This is a campaign ideas for dungeon masters, if you will. And so the first thing he talks about is how to design your campaign, and then he talks about particular adventure. Here's his suggestions. I'll go through them. Pick your name of your world. Think about the sort of what your world is like, right? Is it, is it nightmarish? Is it desolate? Is it high fantasy? Think that through. What kind of kingdoms do you have? What kind of creatures are there? Draw your map. He says, draw out your big map. And you really, several people said this, I think it's very true, focus on a small part of that where you're going to start off. And he suggests you use an island because it's nicely contained. And that way you can sort of justify the fact like maybe there's no boats to get off the island, so your characters are going to play there for a little while, and you don't have to do the whole, continent. Then come up with some system like what rules you're using, RuneQuest, Dungeons and Dragons, whatever, or your home rules, whatever they are. Make sure you know what your rules are and that your game's going to be designed around those rules. And then put out a few notes about the different races and tribes or whatever that live around this area. The second thing he says is for a particular adventure, right? He says don't write things down that you'll remember. That's his personal advice. I think maybe he feels like that'll make it flow better. He says he hopes you'll be good at improvisation and creating some things because you really don't want to have to write down every single detail. It's too much work, and it'll cause the actual play to be a little too stilted. But anyway, what's the basis of the adventure? What's the background? What's happening here, right? Describe the areas, in particular those where you feel like you need detail, provide detail. Make sure you have clear descriptions of important NPCs or opponents. And I think that's an excellent suggestion. Like key NPCs, interesting NPCs are a really important part of good games, in my opinion. And then the major events. What are the major events? Make sure you understand how those are going to work. So those are Paul's ideas. More to come, he says. It's going to be a recurring article. The book review by Dave and Faye Symes, don't know if I'm saying that correctly, are literally just books that they've read. Christopher Stosshoff's A Wizard in Bedlam, excellent, they say. Jerry Pornell, King David's Spaceship, it might be King David's Spaceship. Not his best, they say. They didn't like this one. So, you always feel like you get a good review and they're giving you some mixed responses, right? Ian Watson, God's World. He called it a beautiful, remarkable book, one of the best I've ever read. Ian Watson, God's World. So, never heard of it, but maybe I should go find it. P.J. Farmer, Dark is the Sun. Overlong, often tedious, but still enjoyable. And then Michael Moorcock, The Sword and the Stallion, True Sword and Sorcery, for which he is well known and well loved by his fans. So I think they're saying if you like Michael Moorcock, this is another one of his books. It's exactly what you're looking for. And then finally, The Eternal. It says it's from a book written something called The Star Seekers by Faye Symes. I don't know if that's a book or a poem or what, but anyway, here it is. And it's basically it reads sort of like a poem or maybe just a little bit of narrative to me from something. I don't know. I guess they were trying to get a little something different. All right, now let's look at our illustrations. These are from the cover, as I mentioned before. And then I'm not sure who did these. I think the person was done by the same guy that did the cover. I'm not sure who did the little world with the moon and the little creature with the book reviews, but just sharing that. And then these are from the adventure itself. Again, not positive who drew the sort of skull there, but then I just thought this was interesting. This was just the border that was around the science fiction pages, and Alan Hunter did that, the little iconography that goes around there. And then this is also Alan Hunter, this big hippo-looking guy who was in the editorial page, and then this art that was there on the article about the samurai. And that is it for Fanzine Friday Thunderstruck number 4. For those of you who celebrate, I hope you have a Merry Christmas. Enjoy your weekend. Hope you get to play some games with your family or friends. And until next time, keep rolling 20s.